title, if you've seen it, is Shopping for Public, Critical Writing and Public Engagement. And it's kind of it's loosely based on the idea of using social media for art writing to reach a broad audience. But the idea is that's an umbrella to cover a few other issues that we want to talk about. And those key issues that I wanted to raise, they kind of start here in some of them, but I'll be distributing a series of just questions that we're dealing with in a few minutes. But in general, the idea is several pronged, just how to reach the audience specifically who may go to a shopping mall, how as a writer to be able to address that context of a shopping mall, how as well in a regional center may writing and reaching a public be a little bit different than in an urban center or major population-based urban centers. So these are a few of the things that I wanted to raise and have a dialogue on. So basically today I'll be distributing opening discussion, and some of you I've talked to said you've done some of the readings. I'm giving out readings as an option to do during the course of the workshops or after, but they all relate to what we're talking about. And I'll be doing that today, and then when I introduce the overview questions, and feel free to add to them. We'll have a little talk at the end of this, a little discussion. So I wanted to start with the PowerPoint and give kind of a visual introduction to everything. We just get this out of the way. So a few questions I wanted to talk about is the idea, first of all, of nomadism in the art world, which of course since the 90s has been a big issue, the idea of the nomadic artist traveling from place to place, doing residencies and site-specific work. And does the context, in a regional context, alter artwork by the largely urban yet increasingly nomadic artists? So is regionally exhibited artwork displaced or enhanced by sites? So how is someone coming into a place that they may or may not be familiar with, dealing with that space and dialoguing about it? And then how does writing for these spaces differ from that of an urban center? How does the art facilitate exchange between public and artist? And is the show itself, is it a cultural colonization of the Rainbow Center, or is it an exchange between audience and visiting artists? So the idea is where does the public come into play? How as writers can we deal with that? And as we go on in the discussion, can we reach a public by social media? So the first image I wanted to present is an exhibition held by Rikrit Tira Venezia, and where he's preparing Thai food as he has over the years in a commercial space. And in the next one, and I think this might have been Art. This is either Gavin Brown Enterprises or Art Basel, but whatever the case, it's Gavin Brown Enterprises in New York, and he is engaging the audience. And the question I wanted to raise is, who exactly is the audience if they're going into a New York gallery? Is it a real communal eating experience, or is it an exclusive club? And as a nomadic artist or someone who travels everywhere and does this, and in many cases performs the same thing wherever he is, he serves Thai food. His background is Thai. He actually studied at OCA as well in Toronto. But the idea is just, where does the public come into play if his piece is the same wherever he goes nomadically? So Rikrit's work. Now, here's one more of them. And as he's preparing the food, and I wanted to set a little bit of a comparison to the space at the Rainbow Center and how that work is in progress today with this image. This one is from Art Basel. This one is a blueberry pie eating contest at the Rainbow Center in 2012. And I wanted to raise the similarity between Rurkert's piece and the blueberry pie eating contest. This was not intended to be art. It was performative, obviously. But how would an artwork approach that when someone, say, in the case of the work we just looked at, did something food-based, where it was a communal experience, where people had a good time and talked? How would that differ with something like this? And how would someone approach that exhibiting and writing on the work? This is one more image from the pie eating contest. They seem to be having a lot more fun than in the gallery. It does have a nice sort of performance look to it. And so where exactly does this fit in? And how does existent culture at the mall fit in with the exhibition? So is this, as the arrow is suggesting, is this imposing on the space, or is it adding to the space? Is it enhancing? And how, as writers, do we get the word around? Just a few images of where we were. And so, to shopping carts specifically, I wanted to deal with as well, because again, this kind of relates a little bit to what I was talking about, nomadism. So, does doing something universally, such as Rurkert's piece, where he's doing the same thing everywhere, do universal themes and symbols help art writers reach the public? So, shopping carts in this case, as a universal symbol, is it a means of communicating with local audiences, or when you have such a broadly international symbol, or one that's not specific to culture or site, and it's not specifically local, what kind of dialogue does that raise about kind of a global capitalism and this and that, that the shopping cart can represent? So this is definitely Cogliato's piece, Stuck in the Past, and BGL's Carousel piece, and so forth. Now the next question I wanted to raise as well, is there truly a public or a commons? So if we're talking about public art, in something exhibited in a private space with a universal symbol of global capitalism, is this really public we're doing? Is this really a public context? And whose public is it? So how can we address this, something that's overpowered by private interests? And if we're writing to either an art audience or the general so-called public, how do we address this critically while at the same time we're engaged with such a space? And just, I wanted to show as illustration a picture of Dundas Square in Toronto, which is supposedly our public square. And there's virtually nothing public about it. Everything's private enterprise. There's numerous McDonald's signs, Coca-Cola, virtually no Canadian corporations, except I guess the television or radio station, whatever that is, 24. Labatt's Blue maybe you have, but that's in fact owned by Belgians. But whatever the case, there appears to be virtually no public space, and what has existed there that's public is just horrifically ugly. And then we have the West Edmonton Mall, which literally has no space left. It's this constant bombardment of either entertainment or spectacle and so forth. And one of the readings was an interview with this artist from the West Coast, Vicki Alexander. She did a series quite a few years ago, but in the West Edmonton Mall, and she really focused on the mirrors, this constant self-consciousness, and how it was designed to put you in sort of a dream world, but a dream world effectively that was monitored by capitalism and consumerism and whatnot. So the mirrors factored heavily into her work. And again, raising the question about just how private how private is this space, how public is it? She put a very private act of dreaming and reflection and self-consciousness, and had it as determined by private interest. So these are some of the issues I wanted to raise about the actual space. Now, on a social media, how then to talk about a place like a shopping mall? I was very interested in this writer as the idea he has, not always loving his writing. Brian Roccour, he's an art critic from New York. He's said he was going to stop writing for Art Form and Art in America. I put it in past perfect. I said, who has written? Because he actually still does. But he claimed he was going to give it up for strictly writing Yelp reviews. Now, he cites Denise Diderot as an inspiration. It's a bit of a stretch, but in that he wants to write about art for the people in Roccour's words. So, one of the things I wanted to raise in this workshop, and that's central to actually the tasks at hand, I think, are what publication venues for writing on art, including Yelp, can we find that reach a public beyond the art world? And how can that apply to what's at hand here, the exhibition, and so forth? So, it's a little screenshot of his reviews, and I've got them on handouts, so nothing to read through in detail is necessary here. But say he covers Bronx Museum of the Arts. He's had about 89 reviews up, and he's given a large number of 5 stars as opposed to 1 star, where he's given few, and so forth. And then, people get to feedback on the review itself. Was it useful, funny, or cool? And here's a picture of him. Denise Diderot as well. And this is G&O's Yelp site, which I noticed was actually empty. And I wanted to bring a screenshot of that, I guess at some point with hopes that someone might contribute to it. There's a write a review little thing up there. This is, a couple of people will know her here, and from Toronto, Nadja Sage, and she formed something called Art Stars, which was a YouTube and web-based series of broadcasts. Wasn't the first of these. Walter Robinson did one from New York in the 90s called Gallery Beat. That was a series of videos sort of pre-YouTube-ish, and was doing recorded sort of, you go right into it and talk about the work. And her stuff, she hasn't been doing so much art-based stuff, she's writing for Vice now, but she found a good way of dealing with art criticism in a way that wasn't the traditional form. So it was an interesting model in that she'd actually go and talk to people. A lot of times she was quite critical of some of the hypocrisy in the art world and would confront people, and she used humor and kind of odd clothing and so forth to bring this across. And it's an interesting idea. So something I wanted to raise as a possibility. In the third workshop, I'm going to talk a little more about actual exhibition catalog writing, and how that can be maybe more web-based so that people can interact with catalog texts as well as art writing. But for this one, I'm focusing a little more on the actual reviewing. And this is the Yelp site for the Rainbow Center. And it didn't get such a good review on the first one. I don't get why everyone bags on this place all of the time. It's not the greatest mall, but it serves its purpose. The Rainbow Center itself is reviewed, yet there's not art coverage. So that's some of the dialogue I wanted to set up. And I'm very open to discussion today. That's sort of the key of what I wanted to do. And I'm going to give out some of the readings first. And the questions that I have are some of which were on the PowerPoint. They're here, so they're on top. teaching is ending very quickly, not to worry. So yeah, these are the questions. The first one was on the power plant slide, but just the series of questions about, does art writing for regional galleries differ from writing for galleries in major urban centers? And then the site-specific works, artists are coming to a location with which they're unfamiliar. So is it enough if artists engage in site research? And how can art writers better reach the general public when we talked about universal themes in number 3, or what I talked about? Number 4, is there truly a public or commons? And number 5, Yelp, blogs, and what other ways are there to, and venues are there to reach the public in non-traditional ways? May soon become traditional, but non-traditional ways in art writing. And how does the experience finally of the writer visiting the site come into play? Should personal narrative enter curatorial writing? Critical writing in the 80s and 90s, there was a lot of fictional elements, and people tried to put in narrative and fiction. That disappeared in many ways. The odd person practices that. So I sort of wanted to raise that as well. How, when you're actually looking at something, and when you're, in my case, coming from out of town to look at a site, how does my experience come into play, or should writers try to remain a sense of detachment? How does the personal response and narrative come into art writing? So this is the frame of what I wanted to ask, and I wanted to open up to questions and comments about how you feel. What I suggest is going through the readings if you can, and if not, when you get back home or after the workshops. And if possible, when tomorrow we're going to be visiting the site, that's the plan. And then but I'm hoping maybe after the workshops that someone or some people can post reviews in some ways. It could be on the blog, it could be posted on any sort of social media thing, Facebook, whatever. And it's also possible that 1 or 2 that we may include in the catalog. So that's sort of the idea. But today I wanted to open up and start asking questions about this very broad range of things that I'm talking about. So that's what I'd like to start with, if there's any questions. Comments?
Well, one comment I have is I found that push carts was really interesting, is that we're talking about capitalism and everything else, and it's in a mall and all that and everything else, and yet there's another experience we have of push carts, which is kind of nomadic, which doesn't have much to do with the arts, is vagrants filling their whole lives or whatever they have in a push cart, hanging around, trolling around the mall, but not being actually discouraged from participating in almost any of this, but still using the same.
Yeah, they come into play. How do they come into the... I mean, it's a good question, because then the shopping cart takes on quite a different meaning. Obviously, it shifts into the poverty narrative, and then you've got, at the same time, you've got the upside and downside of capitalism. Does that, does the fact that we're putting shopping carts in actually form a critique of that because you see the contrast, or does it impose on it? It's an interesting issue. Yeah, I don't know whether there's an answer, but
I don't either, that's why I asked it.
Yeah, I have no answer to that. But I think it's a good debate to talk about the ethics of that. I think coming and having not been to Sudbury and so forth, I was kind of thinking it would be an opulent mall, and you'd be seeing a little more like West Edmonton-ish, and it's much different. It's interesting, so it does set a good context.
When it comes to a forum for arts writers, I'm just wondering if there is such a... Is there a public forum for arts writers that is well attended? I mean, because Yelp is certainly not meant to be a forum for a discussion on arts.
There's social media groups and things, but if you look like the International Association of Art Critics has a Facebook page, but nothing really gets done on it. It's still conference based, and they're actually their September conference, October conference this year is on social media, and they're finally, but it's a very slow move in the criticism world to embrace this. And one of the things over the course of the workshops I wanted to mention is I remember having discussions about interactive web-based writing in the mid-90s, very similar to this in how you can get audience interaction by people can comment and the writer can update. And in fact, I remember talking about this series of curatorial workshops I organized in the mid-90s at Interaccess, which is a media arts center, talking about the idea that people could actually do interactive editing, like they could change the writer's text if they had permission. And we were talking about all of this, but it never really happened. And I think till a couple of years ago, till just social media ballooned. But yeah, criticism seems very slow to adapt to any kind of change. And at the same time, it's mired in a bit of a stasis now because it's being less read in places, where there is a larger art market than Canada. The critic isn't really that important in the totem pole in determining the success of the artist. So I think maybe that's where why the Yelp one came out of New York, because it's the critics are realizing a kind of powerlessness there, and they always had that in Canada anyway. And they're looking at alternative ways to reach the public and so forth. So I think it's as for forums, no, there's not that much of a social media world. I mean, the interesting thing is about Brian Rocker is he's very critical of a lot of new media art. At the same time, he's working with social media. And I'm wondering if one of the reasons he went onto something outside of art criticism is there's so little critical writing that is actually critical of things or judgmental, that I think he felt this is a place where I can actually judge a little bit more because his writing style is a little more judgment-based.
Instead of being in contrast to analysis?
In contrast to analysis or just overall description, I think in many ways what someone summed up art criticism's role now is almost a kind of explaining something through a simplified philosophical lens. You're setting certain theory to it, but it's not going into the theory in depth as a philosopher would, but it's setting it that way and trying to see how the work fits into certain theory, and it in that way it's expositional. I mean, rather than analytical, it's explaining it to people who already know what it is about. So it raises there is a lot of, and it's a large dialogue about what's the role of the critic now, especially with artists by practice now having an MFA, and they're schooled in theory. Why do you need critics if they know the same theory as an artist? So I think that this is where this is coming out of some of this need to. So perhaps it didn't just come out of the electronic media and technological advancements, but also need for change in art criticism, which has been very slow to come. Oh, sorry, I think you just had sequence.
I went with a video to Supermarket Art Fair in Stockholm.
Okay.
And we showed a Tim Hortons cup that was beaded, like native beading.
Uh-huh.
And the curator at a video, Scott McGovern, and I were discussing it. He felt it was quite controversial, and he said, I'm going to put it on Reddit. And in 16 hours, we got 250,000 hits.
Wow.
And then... And most of the comments were Canadian, so right away it was who made you the representatives of us abroad, and then some people were into the cup and some people thought it was horrible and some people got it, and even the Voice of Fire came up, of course, right? I totally
thought people had forgotten
that would come up. And then there was several interviews, and so we had a big show when we came back at Cambridge Gallery. One of the board members, Iga Janik, facilitated that. And we printed all the Reddit stuff and all this, all the interviews we had on big pieces of paper on the wall. And here we are, where it's in public media, but the discourse that's occurring is it's wonderful and it's interesting, but are you as an art critic gonna jump in and kind of go back to, and some, there's questions like, why is this valuable, right? And so it's like it's great, but it's
That's
a
what
little
you're
bit.
gonna be met with, yeah.
And yeah,
But I think that's it. The numbers are interesting because say the Dange's Art Stars, which I just showed, she'd maybe have 500 hits, maybe 1,500 at the most. And there was a seminar she ran on art criticism, just sort of the role of art criticism now kind of thing. And I think there were under 200 hits on that. And I realized I'd hit it probably 10 times, so that would take up 10.
so it's us.
And, yeah, it's us.
It's
And,
us looking
yeah.
at this versus,
Yeah.
so the audience is still like us and them.
Yeah, it's us and them, and then but such a high number. I mean, is there a way to sort of bridge that where an art audience can get the review and the public can get it? And I think at the same time, the comments are interesting because if you even look at, you figure if you read the Toronto Sun, you're going to get these sort of, random comments or whatever. But you get that when you read the Globe too in the comment sections, including on contemporary art or whatever you're reading, the Times, and it seems like that's the nature of comments. There's some sort of angry, flaming people. So maybe it's just the nature of comments themselves, along with not knowing about art too.
It was so exciting to see the passion of Canadians towards art, of the power of art, of
Yeah,
course.
yeah.
But because we were in Sweden, it was kind of like, oh, you are representing me now, and therefore I must, express my feelings towards this work.
What a national icon, which is
Yeah.
what Jimmy's got.
Yeah, yeah.
That's a very bizarre expectation. I mean, you have a government or, the Canada consulate won't put a cent towards anything out there, and then people are complaining that you're, not, you're supposed to be representing Canada, but they won't pay you to go there. But, strange.
Well, I don't think that much thought.
Yeah. I don't know. But, no, I'm surprised. I wouldn't have thought that people I thought people maybe do Voice of Fire or something like that, but I didn't think they'd be that concerned about how Canada's perceived. I mean, people...
Perceived anyway.
Well, yeah.
Sensitive, yeah.
Yeah, we are sensitive about that, I guess. Yeah, that no one knows who we are.
Well, in the last few years, more so, because we got rid of our peacekeepers and we're going to war and everything else. And we have
Why are they worried about it?
Well, we're worried about it now because we're being represented by a benign dictator, which is completely changing our country. So I think a lot of Canadians were like, oh, it's fine when we were talked about and we're all snow and ptarmigans and all that. And luckily, all of a sudden now we have this I don't want to say face of evil, but
Well, we do. The
Close
children,
enough.
children
the international
poverty,
relations have
the
changed so much.
Canada Accord that we back out of the.
Exactly.
It's
Yeah.
just getting to be a longer and longer list. So.
It is, no, it is, but it's an interesting idea, but that also raises a bit what I guess that I wanted to talk about too is how when you're going to another site, who is your audience? And in that case, you had an audience that was back home, and then people obviously wouldn't read Tim Hortons cups in any particular way in Sweden. It reminds me of I think it was a '99 Venice Biennale, Tom Dean did the Wonder Bread icons or images and designs, and no one knew in Europe what that was. So it had an entirely different meaning, and to me it was a bit of a problem because it was meant to be an abstraction of kind of pop culture, and then no one would really know that. It just looked like David Hurst dots. And so yeah, that's an interesting point. And you had a question. So.
Yeah, and actually Julie's comments sort of bridge into it well, because my question was just, given the title Shopping for a Public, I did notice that the followers of Brian Bacour's Yelp reviews were limited, and you were mentioning
Yeah.
numbers for art stars. So, how do you build an audience online through these media? Because the question is are you just making art discourse more approachable, or are you actually, is it an opportunity to build and expand and reach new people? So obviously the example that Julie mentioned,
It's a good
might
question.
touch on that, but how do you build an audience in these more approachable media?
Yeah, well, I mean, for me, I think personally, and I think it's debatable. Obviously, my focus or interest is more on a dialogue I can have as a writer, because I always feel I think that's why, because I curate at the same time, I'm used to doing talks and interacting with people, and I always find in criticism this is what's really missing. So this idea not just the numbers of the public, but that I can actually talk to people about the work underneath the review is really of interest to me. So for me, getting an engaged audience would mean their feedback more than numbers. For other people, maybe numbers is really important too. But the idea is I want to know what people think, even if they don't like it, and what kind of questions you have. Because I find it, I was recently at the Art Gallery Peterborough, and we had just a wonderful discussion by the show that I curated was on walking, and we had this wonderful discussion about how, one person did walking as pilgrimage and so forth, and they weren't practicing artists, or they didn't have a stake in the art community professionally, and they were doing these amazing sort of discussions. And I thought, as an art writer and as a catalog writer, I'm always very alienated in that I don't have that debate. And the reality is a lot of criticism isn't read, so maybe that the numbers come into play in some way, but for me, just the feedback and the discussion is really what I think is interesting. And the idea of, I think Drucker's idea of reviewing for Yelp as a statement needs to go a little beyond that and now start to use it as an actual tool. So that was my thought on that. But I think, how to reach an audience, it has to be something the public will be interested in to get the numbers, like the Tim Horton Cup. But how to keep them engaged and hopefully having a real dialogue, I think, would be crucial. So maybe 10 people who have a dialogue who didn't come in with such a knowledge of art and really engage with it, that would be of interest to me, I think.
So an organization like Tate Modern will often have a Q&A available where you can post a question to the curator or a curator's assistant or someone in the organization, and they'll respond. Are there organizations that do that? And
I've seen that in other museums.
Is it successful in that? Do you think that they're really building a real dialogue? I've read through a few of the Tate's Q&As.
Yeah.
Is it, or what's your experience?
Well, what I can see that I've seen in terms of, I'm not part of the museum world as much as I am public galleries, but one thing I did see was they had an Ask a Curator set up on, I think it was either YouTube or where you could have an interactive discussion, and then I can't remember how it ended up back on YouTube, but the idea is you could directly interact with a curator from different centers, and it was predominantly curatorial studies students asking how you get a job was actually the key question that kept coming up, and it wasn't ultimately such a success.
You don't.
Yeah, you won't. Good luck. But so it was funny in that sense, but it didn't seem to meet that much with success. But I don't know how much you get, but the idea is you ask, but it's not an ongoing dialogue, like on, say, Facebook, for instance, where you can have ongoing discussion about things. And I find if I post articles or share them or whatever, I get more feedback and discussion about art than than if I publish something in an art magazine. I maybe get 2 or 3 comments. At an opening a few months later, I don't get that much feedback. In fact, editors are so busy in underfunded publications, you talk very little about it with the editor for that matter. So you kind of feel like you're working in a vacuum. So I find like actually talking about art through social media rather than my art reviews, there's more interaction. So I think I'm not sure if that's been met with success if there's not an ongoing dialogue.
One of the secrets of social media, though, is also you don't just put out stuff. You see people put out stuff and not many people comment on it, but you see people that put out stuff but also comment and go search an audience. It goes both ways. You can't just take from social media. Because if you don't give to social media and really engage it and put time into it, whatever the social media, you're not setting up the conduit, so nothing's going to come back. And some people fail to realize it is that simple. The conversations are based on context more than depth, but the depth will come after the context. But you really got to engage. You also got to give a lot and go searching things to engage in for them to come and engage with you, or else it's going to be a one-way road and you're going to be just preaching to a choir that gets a smaller and smaller voice all the time.
So essentially you have to network.
Yeah, social media is a different word for
Yeah,
networking.
like, yeah.
It is,
I guess you sort of sometimes lose that if in the, think you can have a blog and just post stuff, but you have to actually network.
Go
connect.
network other blogs,
Yeah.
and you'll be getting, your
Network
blog
other
will get
bloggers.
spread around, and
Yeah.
like she said, Reddit, right? I don't use WordPress, but I know a lot of people that use WordPress, but the one thing about using WordPress is WordPress is read by more people, not just in the art, than anything else in the world, because everybody who in North America and Europe that does research at university, everything is printed on WordPress. So every higher learning institution puts stuff on WordPress. So a lot of people fail to realize how much traffic there is on WordPress. Inane little things to entire, studies published and everything else. And WordPress is also a good one to use, and you'll build up pretty quickly.
Yeah, I think also two examples I'd like to cite when you mentioned blogs that you need to network. I think two really successful blogs use or one blog and one online. One is it's done in a blog format, but it's an online. There's Art F City, used to be Art Fag City, that Patty Johnson runs, and she posts on Facebook all the time updates. So she's cross-media, working cross-media, and I find I read that a lot. And then Hyperallergic, which is also in New York, and they probably do about 20 Facebook posts a day, and I think that's the thing I share the most. Their writing isn't always great, it's up and down, but at the same time, you get instant sort of debate about things. So say, as soon as the Detroit Institute of Art was talking about, the city was talking about selling the work, it's right there the next, few hours, and then you can have a dialogue about that, and then you share it with your friends, and it's amazing how quickly that gets around. So I think, if you have an online critical site, whatever form it takes, whether it's a blog or whether it's a web page, the idea of getting it out there and getting it posted and shared seems really important for debate. So I find I've got all these personal little discussions about Hyperallergic that they probably, they don't know exist. And there's all these other pockets going around, and it becomes a forum, and I realize I barely ever look at the web page anymore, but I click on their postings of the articles on Facebook, because at least for me, I find that's how I can talk to people about it. And then I post it to like-minded people and this and that. So that's important. Yeah.
I think that maybe one idea about social media that I could kind of advance, and I don't know an awful lot about it other than the extent to which we're all kind of immersed in it, is that it's a development of mass media.
Yes.
It's a personalized form of mass media.
Yes.
Where broadcast is accessible to everybody.
Yeah.
And that I think we, forget that.
Yes, we do.
Character of it at our peril.
We do.
And that, print media and other more limited and circumspect forms of media have a place. There's a reasonable argument, at least I feel it's reasonable out of my own experience, that as a critic, my public is the artist who has produced the work.
Okay.
That it's really like, virtually one-to-one dialogue with an artist, conducted under certain terms, that is carried out in an open public forum. But it really doesn't matter much whether the public is interested or not.
Okay.
The broader, university-defined public, that really the dialogue is open to anybody who cares to have to witness that dialogue.
I find that's how I work when I write catalog essays. It's
Yeah.
very similar. It's a collaboration with the artist.
Yes.
And I think that's first and foremost, and at least for me, that I figure, but I'd like people to respond to it, but I'm not going to write it so that they will respond to it necessarily. But what you said at first was really, really interesting, because Yes, all the sites are controlled by a kind of, Facebook has its own structure and it filters how you think and interact. And in the early 90s, when computer technology and web technology, there was a debate about corporate control. So say, for example, Mac Paint, which was this pre-Illustrator, I remember talking about with computer artists saying, I don't like how these programs are advancing because I have less control and it's a corporately defined kind of artwork. And then people would program to get around that. And I found, maybe it's just my social circle or whatever, but there seemed to be less debate. There's more acceptance that, we're just going to publish on WordPress and so forth, but we're not going to talk about who controls the structure, the foundation, be it Facebook or Tumblr or whoever, or do they represent the interests that we have? So, I think that's a really good point. And I'd like to see the debate open again.
In print format, the audience for criticism that's appreciated almost in and of itself, say a journal like October, is probably 1,500 to 3,000 copies. Almost any piece of ambitious written criticism
that's
in
a normal
university
circulation.
Press. Normal circulation is 1,500 to 3,000.
They should see your views when it was around.
Which roughly corresponds with the numbers for any Canadian university or artist-run center publication. They rarely top out at more than 1,500 copies.
That's a standard.
Anywhere from 500 to 1,500 copies is pretty much the normal print run for any catalog essay.
I think it raises an interesting question. Does circulation, in the print media in many ways, the higher circulation the art magazine, the worse it often is. And does that come into play with social media and things? Say Canadian art would have not a huge circulation, but I'd assume it'd be about 10 times that much. Yet when the quality of the writing compared to C or something is much poorer. And to me, that's something to debate as well. Are you, watering down the work by reaching a broader audience? And is reaching the broader audience coming first, and then you build on the quality of the writing? Drucker is making analogies to Baudrillard and Baudelaire and Diderot, and I don't know how valid they are in today's society, but and so forth. So it's an interesting issue. But in print circulation, I find that there seems to be a watering down when the numbers get higher.
I mean, it's almost like a substitution happens where what becomes of greater interest to the public is usually the spectacle of judgment. This is good, this is bad, this artist is emerging, that artist has, jumped the shark, whatever, those sorts of judgments.
There's a place for judgment and criticism, though, too, I think. I find, say, publications like Canadian Art do neither. They do like sort of who's the hottest artist, but there's never really any real debate or judgment in that. But certainly in, say, Low-End Art Info, there is a little bit. I think I find like Hyperallergic is getting interesting in that they do debate things of interest to an art audience, and they do raise, they're critical of the marketplace and stuff like that, and these raise interesting, matters for people to talk about that are judgmental. So there's a real place for judgment to me. I think if nothing else, simply so we don't have to see so much bad art, but at the same time, you also need the smaller publication analysis. What I think would be an ideal world are specific publications like C or like Philip and so forth, and Moose and whatever, and then a very broad-ranging social media. What I find the magazines I don't like are the ones that are somewhere in between that, like Art in America or Canadian Art, that seem to do neither. But I think really the print magazines that will survive are the ones like you're saying, they're reaching an audience of 1,500. It's a specialized audience, and you can't get that anywhere else. And I don't think you can replicate that on the web in a way that I can think of, unless, like I say, there's a space for sharing the articles or having dialogue. That would be important to me. Yeah, anything else?
It feels like criticism is less common, like, you know, negative criticism in stuff I read versus like reading reviews from Montreal in the French paper. Often I've had to translate them for my friends in Toronto, and they'll just say like straight up that they don't like something or it
Yeah,
failed.
that's right. That's right.
And you know, studying in the East Coast, like that was criticism was something that was totally normal
Yeah.
to exchange openly. Nobody would really take it all that personally. And then to go back to a point that you're making before, I've even heard in the context of jurying art organizations for the council that the written material is inaccessible as a negative.
Yeah. No,
So then you're finding yourself in a, it's better for you to put out really awesome promo and just not even bother.
yeah, no, that's a good point. I think what I found, having studied in the East Coast too, there was incredible debates at NASCAD. But when you get into the art press, that debate doesn't continue as much. And I think there's a need for that somewhere. And particularly in Toronto, people are very polite and worried about who's going to be in the next jury. And then you get it the other way. People realize, oh, there's no judgment, and then people are just kind of getting nasty without really going into any depth. And, you know, I think, you know, ultimately there's a need for debate, and there's a need for real theoretical underpinnings. There's a need for both. But I just found some of the public dialogue that I remember having at NASCAD, or even after talks in Toronto, they never really make it in print. And it'd be really interesting to see also what, you know, how people really think in a thought-out, complete article rather than just discussion or something. But yeah, it's a good point. And yeah, I've heard the same about Montreal papers. People from Montreal would complain about Toronto is so kind. But at the same time, if it's ill-informed, because I remember reading a review by Murray White, who writes for the Toronto Star, about a show that was held in this pioneer village kind of thing. And he was very critical of a couple of artists because and he couldn't go into depth in a newspaper, of course, because he was not just a newspaper, but reviewing an entire show. And then he was saying, oh, their work doesn't fit the context and everything. And the reality was the curating was, you know, if you directly reference, like if your piece makes butter or something, to reference a Pioneer Museum, it's going to be really boring. And he seemed to want that literalist. So he liked one that made paper and so forth, and completely dissed this other work. And I thought, God, you know, careful what you wish for, more judgmental criticism, because this was not thought out at all. It wasn't any understanding of curating, and he didn't seem very open to talking about what I didn't agree with on that. But so yeah, you get a little bit of. And I think in Canada the community is small. I mean, that you are scared of making an enemy and so forth, and that kind of thing. So that contributes somewhat to it. Where, you know, a newspaper critic in New York can make lots of enemies because they're there.
Say historically we have, say in the 90s we had an artist here writing in the newspaper that generated response, and he would sometimes be quite blatant on purpose to generate response, but he was also had a background that support his writing. And I think if now he were still available here, and we also had the social media part that the newspaper has now, that could have grown here.
Yeah, no, there was when I noticed I can't remember the name of the White Horse paper, but there was a good debate about some of the exhibitions going on in editorial, because the North is very sure and interested in their identity, and consequently, if works dealt with Northern themes, it would reach public discussion. And it was amazing how much space was actually devoted to art and the discussion surrounding it. So it's also, I think, maybe like you said, it takes one good person or a couple of people to get that thing going, but it's also the sense of place that people have. I mean, there's very little editorial interest in any Toronto paper in contemporary art. You wouldn't see an editorial in an exhibition. Yet in smaller centers like Whitehorse, you do. And, you know, there's a bit of, you know, we've got local pride. I think the North has a confidence. It seemed to be in the Yukon has a strong confidence and identity. And then Toronto is, like I always say, is the Woody Allen of cities. It's completely insecure. And if you don't have a sense of place, how can you talk about the work and the paper in that sense? But yeah, interesting point, because yeah, newspaper criticism is lacking in Toronto, and you don't get anything like The Guardian, where there's an ongoing public debate about art in England, whether people like it or not, but there's a debate. But yeah, we don't have that. Maybe smaller centers are interesting in that sense for that. That's been my experience anyway.
I have a question just related to that. It's the exchange between, let's say, the artist and the art critic. Sort of follow up on what Ken was talking about. And that is whether, from the artist's point of view, if you find that the impact of criticism is greater coming from an art critic, or the comments that sort of follow the art critic's work. So there's a dialogue between the art critic and their audience that the artist now has access to. So, I don't know, for the artist among us here, the criticism that you receive from the art critic versus the criticism you're receiving from the general public, how much of that impacts the work? Whereas traditionally, I think there's a really, I would say, a strong dialogue that's happening between the art critic and the artist in, let's say, print media. But now that the artist is exposed to that dialogue with the general public, just how does that impact the work?
Yeah, it's interesting, because also you get it sort of, they'll be discussing the work through the lens of the critic, and if the artist bounces back and say comments him or herself on it, not commenting on his or her work as much as commenting on how someone else perceives it. It's kind of an interesting chain of things, I guess. I haven't seen that where people say, or actually the artist would respond to someone's criticism, or even, I write quite a few catalog essays, and typically, like I was saying a few minutes ago, to me it's a collaborative process with the artist, but when it comes to editing, the artist is pretty well left out. It becomes directly with the institution of the writer and so forth. But yeah, it's interesting to see the artist come back into the picture and be able to discuss the criticism. And like I said, our artists are as theoretically schooled as critics are now in many cases, and why shouldn't there be that level of talk? I think, but I'd like to see it. I'm always wondering on sort of Facebook posts about art reviews or so forth, is the artist ever going to come back and say, wait a minute, this is not right. But I've yet to see it. And then not the public fights between critic and artist that there used to be. Like I remember the one in Toronto in the 80s with Harold Town and John Bentley Mays. And it just reached kind of ridiculous points where each were publicly insulting them each other in print. And I can't remember what, Harold Town is actually a terrible artist in my view as a painter, but he's not a bad writer. He's kind of funny. And I can't remember what he called May's writing, but it was extremely funny. And then, John Bentley Mays would go and say, he's this hack painter who gets drunk at the right Rosedale party, and then you'd have this and that. Or the one between Julian Schnabel and Robert Hughes. He started, I think in Schnabel's autobiography, started spreading rumors that Robert Hughes hit on him and all of these weird things. He had this imaginary character who seemed a lot like Robert Hughes in the book. Rode a motorcycle and so forth. So there were all these public fights, but it's funny that I haven't seen them up here. Maybe it's something I missed, but
They probably sold a lot of papers, some of the papers themselves.
I wonder. wonder. I don't know how many papers John May sold, but whatever the case, it was kind of a funny little debate. Or some of the, John Scott still won't speak to Philip Monk. I mean, that goes back from 1986, and it's like so where exactly is that in the social networking sphere? And it doesn't seem to appear so much, but there are these sort of camps that have been in the real world that have been around. So,
well, 2 years ago, I know a critic who, I won't name in Toronto, this was like a trauma situation, but one of the artists had moved away, he was having a show in Toronto, and his show wasn't well reviewed by this one critic, who actually was still one of the critics that was still critical in his critiques. Anyways, so how the artist responded, he didn't respond, but the artist has a huge following, a huge bevy of really, it's almost messianic. Yeah. So he just made out a social network call. And everybody commented, and it was the most story ever commented in that newspaper of all of his friends, but not him, but he led it, taking to task the critic and actually being quite vicious. That's why I'm not saying names. Yeah. But the critic actually took it. It's funny because it was completely reversed, and the critic actually took it personally that there was so much traffic attacking his criticism about this one show, which was possibly one of the artist's weakest shows in 5 years anyway. So, he wasn't being wrong, but his following just took it, and he called on his following. He said, okay, we've got to get this fucker back. And his people actually got the critic back just by the commentary, just filled out more than that. It was strange, because you can, on those comment boxes in the newspapers, a lot of them, you don't have to put your name down. So you can just, it's anonymous, so it's just like calling out somebody or giving the finger out of a car. It's just like, oh, you feel good about it, but you know what I mean? There's no responsibility.
It is Fast and Furious and not thought out. What was the debate with Art Fag in around 2000 is that he would, we all know who he is now in Toronto, but he went by the name Art Fag and wrote very funny, catty criticism. And there was a debate whether he should reveal his name or not. And he just figured you couldn't say what he did without, hiding it. And ultimately it didn't matter what his name was, but it was kind of like this. It's like people when they're restaurant critics, they sneak into the restaurant without saying they're critics. And then it was kind of that. And so there were all these rumors going around of who he was. And eventually it was revealed who he was, but it was an interesting thing. There was a fear that you can't go public with your name, and if you use an avatar, if you use a pseudonym or whatever it is, you're have a little more liberty and freedom. So in his case, I think it was probably a good thing because it really vamped up sort of the fast kind of, and he writes regularly for Canadian art now, different publications. He's written for C and does, but when he was doing it as a blog, I think it was either blog or website, I think it was a blog, it was like people would follow it with much more interest than reading, say, Canadian art, because they're kind of, what's he going to talk about next? And he's speaking about what we all wanted to say. And some of it was just outright funny. And he'd make some kind of things, like things you'd always wanted to say a little bit, and you say in public, like Toronto artists always lionize, or critics lionize a person who has an international name coming in without actually being critical, because we're still the province, and we still feel that anything that has a big name attached to it must be good. And he'd raise things like that, which were interesting. Now it seems sort of everyday practice that people can be very open blog-wise, but at his time it was like the only person who was actually doing that I remember. So yeah, anonymity can work positively. Obviously, in that sense, where they're ganging up, it seemed just a bit cowardly. But
makes me think of the role of the style and of personality of Moxie in your style of writing when you're doing criticism, and how much accent. How fun are you going to make the piece? Is it going to be fun to read in and of itself? Can you hear the reviewer's personality. Do you feel that that kind of do you think that's kind of like a sleight of hand? Do you think it should be more academic sometimes and less, should we be able to hear the critic's voice, or should
I think you need a range of things. I think if you become too self-absorbed as a writer, it's just bad writing. I mean, you can certainly bring a personal stance, but I think writers like John Mays or Leah Sandals, or people who tend to bring a personal element, often fail quite miserably. At the same time, I wouldn't, because they fail to bring the reader in. It feels like you're walking into someone else's dream or personal space a little bit. So, say for example, John Mays wrote this huge, paragraph in a Louise Bourgeois review saying how he felt really sexual when he saw it, and he said at the end he just wanted to pull down his pants. And it's like, I don't want to hear this. Masturbatory writing shouldn't be literally masturbatory. And then some of Leah Sandals, and I'm trying to think who else, Terrence Dick, he writes about, he'll start writing a review writing about his children. And it's like, I don't care if it doesn't tie in. And I find Jerry Saltz a little bit formulaic in that sense. Like, he'll write in that kind of folksy vernacular style, but at the same time, it's almost depersonalized because it's the same every time. If I had specific examples, I could be a little clearer. But I also included Jerry Saltz's Facebook page in that, by the way, where he does, he keeps the maximum of 5,000 Facebook friends, and he keeps a dialogue going that's much different than the criticism he writes. And in many ways, I find it a little livelier because, like I say, he tends to use the same kind of format. And anyone who's putting in a large output, which is one of the problems, I think, with newspaper critics as opposed to people who write for quarterlies or, more art-specific publications, is there's so much output, it becomes a formula. And I mean that not just content-wise, but also technically. Like, you see the same sort of sentence structure, the same introductory paragraph format, and for instance, when Gary Dalton was writing for the Globe, and I mean, if you're doing it once a week, I can hardly blame him, but he'd always start like, I'm on the phone with this artist who's in Milan, and we're discussing the work, and he was always on the phone with someone, or always meeting in the studio, and it really didn't seem of much interest to me, because I was interested in finding out about the work, and that's where I'd like to see the personal stamp. But yeah, it's a good question.
But I just want to make a comment as who you're writing to. If you're writing a newspaper, if you're writing a blog, it's a different audience. It needs to be a little bit more accessible to people.
Yeah.
Instead of writing to a quarterly where people are a little bit more informed, a little bit learned, they have more of a background on what you're discussing.
It's a good question. I mean, I think in terms of a newspaper, yeah, but at the same time, someone like, say, Jerry Saltz in New York Magazine, it's well read, but I don't think that many people outside of the art community or collecting community, say for the Globe, would even read art criticism. It's kind of there to sell ads.
But don't you want people to read that too?
I
You
would.
want people to get engaged and excited because
Absolutely.
it's put in terms that they understand.
Absolutely.
They don't feel alienated.
Yeah, like I say, you really need both.
Yeah.
I think the biggest problem with newspaper criticism for me is the speed that it comes out, and it makes it very difficult to be able to do a proper analysis. And again, technically, as a writer, I mean, I'm a slow writer, I take forever, so maybe that's my approach, speaking there a little bit. But it just seems that, you can't possibly do what you're expected to do. Or someone, when Gary Dalton and Aaron Vaughan took over sort of doing a series of gallery reviews, you just can't cover all of that and go into depth. I think Aaron Vaughan was really good at bringing his personality across without it seeming self-indulgent, though, so he managed to do that pretty successfully. But yeah, that's one of the problems with newspaper criticism. At the same time, some of the, like Roberta Smith and stuff, do amazing writing. But I find that's not enough for me. I need both the art magazine type. Because some of Roberta Smith's, say, for instance, when she looks at more rigorous art, she'll say something like inaccessible, and I'm kind of like, well, why don't you try to access it? That's your job.
She spoke at the Champagne lecture as well.
Yeah.
And she said that she's gonna give the same presentation that she's been giving for, I think, 15 years. She's like, it's the
Yeah.
But she loved the deadlines of the newspaper that make her pump stuff out.
Yeah, yeah,
She
yeah.
has no, like,
I think that's a
read
personal
right.
matter.
Actually, a mental adrenaline that she's addicted to.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a personal matter. I mean, I think, like, at the same time you get, like, an essayist, like, in the New Yorker, not an art writer, but Anthony Lane. He's got just, literally, his reviews really are crossing both academic and public. And maybe that's the ideal place for someone to be. But, you know, I feel like I'm reading an essay, but at the same time I'm reading a film review. And that's maybe where people need to be. But there's not that many critics who achieve that. But I think it's very hard when you're covering the couple of things I'm talking about. They're kind of a gallery-going column, like the Gary Dalt. So you'd only have a paragraph or two in each gallery, and it's just impossible to really get into any depth.
Should we set up a meeting time for tomorrow?
Yeah, we're going to meet at the space and look and discuss the work casually. So, and then on the third workshop, we'll talk about what your reflection is on the work, if you've written anything. And hopefully by that time we'll post something on the GNO Facebook site, blog, and Yelp or anywhere else as well. And this will go on YouTube, apparently, Daniel.
Yeah, as soon as we can upload it.
I think also, when we brought up a great idea that we have to put it on Reddit.
Yes.
Oh man, does anyone have any Reddit food? Because I don't. I have no Reddit food. You can help me.
Yeah, I'm not on Reddit. I've been on it, but anyway, yeah. So tomorrow, 11 o'clock, and we'll just look at the work and have a very casual, informal discussion at the food court.
Okay.